Many people love a good detective story. If you've ever had the honour of going to a murder mystery event, you will know the thrill of walking around in the evening trying to decipher who you can trust and who you cannot. Many years ago, I played a pre-written murder mystery with a set ending. Now, each of us were given a character, but none of us knew who the murderer was according to the storyline. Now, as the evening went on, I began to become suspicious of myself. I felt as though that I was the murderer. But when I gave my final speech as my character and defended myself, I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. Now, turns out I gaslit myself, and I was indeed the murderer the entire time, one so convincing that I had convinced myself that I was innocent. Now, if that isn't an insight into the real psychology of some people, I don't know what is. Now, here in Scotland, crime fiction reigns supreme. It's the most popular genre in the country, and of course, that makes sense. Scotland is the birthplace, after all, of Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the most famous fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes. So naturally, it makes sense why Scotland is home to the international crime writing festival, Bloody Scotland. Now, whilst the crime genre seems somewhat modern in concept, largely dominated by British and American authors, I came to find out recently that crime fiction has its origins in Middle Eastern, East Asian and Indian literary history. Because I was just sitting here one day wondering what the earliest detective story was, and it took me down a rabbit hole of looking at the crime genre in general to the evolution of the detective story. And what I found was that the oldest proto-crime fiction has been identified as The Three Apples, a medieval Arabic tale from 1001 Nights. Now, warning, the following is quite a gruesome tale, as are the other tales that shall be discussed in today's video. So you may want to skip this one, or may want to skip this video, but I will always leave timestamps so you can skip the stories in case you are sensitive to the details. Now, this particular story involves the death of a young lady, and quite a gruesome death at that. So the tale tells of a fisherman who discovers a really heavy locked chest along the Tigris River. He never unlocks the chest, but he sells it to Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Harun is curious about the chest that was found, and he orders the chest to be broken into. But to his horror, inside aren't jewels or gold, but the body of a young woman chopped up into pieces. Harun orders his vizier, Jafar ibn Yahya, to find the murderer, and if he fails to solve the crime within 3 days, he will be executed. Naturally, under that kind of pressure, Jafar falls into a pit of despair, and paralysed by the magnitude of the task and his inability to solve it in such a short time, he remains at home the entire 3 days. So on the 4th day, Harun sends for Jafar to be executed as promised, but before anything happens, 2 mysterious men appear. Now, one is an extremely handsome young man, and the other is an elderly man. And each comes forward and presents themselves as the murderer. Now, it's not as though they are claiming to have murdered the woman collaboratively. Oh no. Both are arguing with each other, calling the other one a liar, for he alone murdered the woman, or so he claims. The only detail that singles out the murderer from the other one is that the young man can detail what the woman's chest looks like, a detail which the older man cannot give. Now, it turns out the 2 men know each other, and they're not that mysterious at all. The old man was the woman's father, and the young man was her husband. But the old man and the young man are also related. The old man is the young man's uncle, making the marriage between 2 cousins, and the uncle was attempting to take blame for the murder to protect his nephew. But why would his nephew do such a thing? And why did the father of the woman not care and wanted to actually take the fall for the murder? Well, the younger man gives a eulogy about his wife, calling her the perfect wife. She was one who was kind, generous, and a brilliant mother to their 3 children. Yet, one day, his wife became very ill, and she requested a rare apple from her husband. This rare apple was located in Basra, a 2-week journey from him in Baghdad. So he took the long journey, and when he arrived, he found 3 of these rare apples in the orchard of the Caliph, and he took 3 of them to his ailing wife. However, the poor woman was so unwell that she physically was unable to eat them. So alas, the husband left the uneaten apples at home and returned to work in his shop. But later, whilst he was in his shop, he saw a slave walking down the street holding one of the apples. Now these are very distinctive looking apples, they're not apples anyone could find around here, so he called the man over and asked where he got it. "This," the man replied. "Well, this is a gift from my girlfriend." You see, he told the husband that his girlfriend had 3 of these apples that were gifted to her by her husband, who had ventured far and wide to get them. Naturally, meeting the affair partner of his wife, the husband was furious and humiliated, and when he rushed home to find that his wife only had 2 apples remaining, he took a knife and murdered her. In an attempt to hide his crime, he chopped his wife into pieces, wrapped up the body parts in carpets and shawls, and put the body parts in a locked chest. He then carried the chest off from his home and dumped it in the Tigris River. When he returned home, a horrible reality unfolded. His son came forward very apologetically, confessing to his father that he had taken one of the apples to eat, but a slave jumped him and ran off with it. The boy had given chase and begged the slave for the apple back, telling him all about his father's adventures for the 2 weeks to Basra, for the apples for his ailing mother, but the slave merely scoffed, beat the boy to the ground, and ran off with the rare apple. Thus, out of guilt, the husband requests to be executed. But Haran has deep sympathy for the man, and instead he turns to his evidently very useful and incredibly capable Jafar and asks him for another task. He orders Jafar to find the slave who caused this crime, because it's the slave's fault apparently. And Jafar once again only has 3 days to find the slave, or else he will be executed. Once again Jafar performs at his highest and remains at home the entire 3 days despite the threat of execution. On the 4th day, Jafar is summoned for his execution and he accepts his fate. He says goodbye to his family and he hugs his youngest daughter farewell. But as he hugs her, he feels something strange in her pocket. The daughter withdraws and reveals a bright apple. But not just any apple, an incredibly rare apple with the name of the caliph written on it. When asked how she got this apple, the girl states that she bought it from their slave, Rayhan. That's right, the culprit all along was Jafar's own slave, and so Rayhan is arrested and taken to the caliph. But it doesn't end there, oh no, because quite frankly, the men of this era care more about their creature comforts than a woman's life, because Jafar goes and begs the caliph to forgive his slave. As part of his plea, Jafar tells Harun the tale of Nur al-Din Ali and his son Badr al-Din Hassan. The caliph, amazed by the story, pardons the slave, and to console the young man who mistakenly murdered his wife and butchered her to death, the caliph offers a concubine to him as a replacement wife and then showers him with gifts and cherishes him until his death. It always feels rather disappointing when justice isn't really done to the innocent and perpetrators of the crime are let off completely, or worse, rewarded, but this will be a trend that we see throughout the video. I mean, it hasn't always been like this. I mean, at least Heracles had to do 12 labours for killing his wife and children. Before then, yes, he was absorbed for his crimes and deified after it. But he had an excuse. He was struck by madness by a god. This man just didn't communicate. The Tale of the Three Apples is considered the earliest example of a crime story, and it rather sets out and prepares for us the birth of the crime genre as a whole. Now, in these earliest crime genre stories, the reveal of the narrative is exclusively in the hands of the narrator. The tales never at any point invite the reader in. We aren't introduced to characters ahead of time. Characters just appear when they're needed. Nor are readers given clues to objects. Items are revealed as relevant to the reader at the same time they are to the character. There is no audience participation in earlier crime stories, because they were primarily there to share a moral lesson or instill fear in readers. Yet many of the crime stories that we have come to love and know today, from Sherlock Holmes to Miss Marple, are detective stories, a subgenre of crime. The whodunit stories invite the reader to tag along with the detective and play detective themselves. Sometimes readers can arrive at the right conclusion faster than the detective does. But in really good crime fiction, the detective beats us to it. Now, this particular subgenre, believe it or not, is thought to have been invented by one of the lords of Gothic himself, Edgar Allan Poe, in the short story The Murders of the Rue Morgue that was published in 1841. In fact, this genre was so new to the world that Edgar Allan Poe's private detective Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin introduced the world to the word detective in English for the first time. Dupin is an amateur who gradually becomes a consultant to the official prefect when cases are too tough to crack, which, yes, becomes a later characteristic of the professional relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Scotland Yard. Another similarity between the two is Dupin is also a semiotician, someone who studies signs, and yes, that is later a characteristic of Sherlock Holmes himself. Now, Poe didn't have any real background working with the police, and as such it has been argued by people such as K. Cornelius in the biography of Edgar Allan Poe that the character and Poe's knowledge was inspired by the writings of Eugène-François Vidocq, a French criminal turned criminologist whose writings also inspired Victor Hugo and de Balzac. Now, Poe's basic invention of the subgenre launched a fascination in the concept, and the first detective novel written afterwards was Wilkie Collins's 1868 Moonstone, which was serialised in Charles Dickens's journal all the year round. The detective of Wilkie Collins's novel Sergeant Cuff is based on a real-life detective called Inspector Jonathan Witcher, one of the first ever detectives of Scotland Yard. Yet again, sadly, there's a chance that the inspiration for this character and also the serialisation of the story was inspired by a very real and tragic case which took place 8 years earlier in Somerset, 1860. Now, this case involves the death of a child, and quite a graphic one of that, so please skip this to the next timestamp if required. So in June 1860, the newspapers became alight with a sensationalist story which would last for years: the murder of 3-year-old Frances Saville Kent. Now, this is a case I largely got from the research of Chloe Wells, so I'll link her article down below. Road Hill House, where the Kent family lived, had many people living in it at the time of the crime. We had in the family Mr. Samuel Saville Kent, aged 59, an inspector of factories for the Home Office, and his wife, his second wife, Mrs. Mary Kent, who was 40 years old. The pair had 3 children together, and she was pregnant at the time with their 4th. Then we had many children in the household. We had the children from Samuel's first marriage, which ended in the death of their mother. We had Mary Ann Alice Kent, who was 29, Elizabeth Kent, who was 28, and Constance Emily Kent, 16, and William Saville Kent, age 14. Then we had the 3 younger children from the second marriage: Mary Amelia Kent, 5 years old, the victim of the story, Frances Saville Kent, 3 years old, and Eveline Kent, 1 year old. Now, needless to say, quite a big family with a lot of wealth had a lot of staff. There were 3 live-in members of staff. There was Elizabeth Gow, who was 22, who was the nursemaid, Sarah Cox, who was 22 and the housemaid, and 23-year-old Sarah Kerslake, who was the cook. Their other employees did not live in the house, but they were present on the day. We had a 14-year-old Emily Dole, who helped with childcare and the nursemaid. And then we had the garden, stable and groundskeepers: James Holcombe, who was 49, the head, Daniel Oliver, 49 also, and John Alloway, 18 years old, and was rather an assistant to them. So late in the evening on the 29th of June, at around 7 p.m, is when most of the housework was done by the people who did not live there. The housekeeper, Holcombe, locked up the huge gates of the house gardens and left for home with the other groundsmen. At 8 p.m, Elizabeth Gow, the nursemaid, put 3-year-old Frances Saville Kent to bed. The only person known to stay up late was Mr. Kent, the head of the household, and he worked until 10 p.m. After 10 p.m, he wandered around the house and checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked and bolted, and then he went to bed around 11:30 p.m. Around 1 a.m, the guard dog was heard barking, but because the behaviour was not unusual, the dog was ignored. At 5 a.m, the groundsman Holcombe arrived back at the house to work. Nothing he had locked up the night before was unlocked, and he went straight to the stables as usual. Elizabeth Gow, the nursemaid, woke up also around 5 a.m, but she didn't need to be. But when she woke, she found Frances's cot empty, but the cot's sheets were neatly folded. The neat folding of the sheets threw her off guard, as the sentimentality behind such a gesture suggested there wasn't anything to be concerned about. Perhaps his mother had come in and fetched him in the night and taken him to her room, so she never thought much of it. The cook and the housemaid, both called Sarah, began their day at 6 a.m. Sarah Cox, who was the maid, began unbolting the windows and doors. But when she went downstairs, she found the downstairs drawing room had been already unlocked, and the middle sash window was partly open. Now, assuming someone had come in already and wanted to air out the room, she closed the window and carried on. At 7 a.m, Elizabeth Gow knocked on the bedroom door of Mrs. Kent's room to retrieve Frances, only to find that Mrs. Kent didn't know what she was talking about. Now she was concerned. Elizabeth went to check on the other children, but Frances wasn't in their rooms. By 7:30, the alarm was raised. Frances was officially missing and nowhere in the house. All the household staff were ordered to search for him, whilst Alloway, the assistant groundskeeper, was sent to the village police. Mr. Kent then turned to his eldest son, William, to go fetch the local parish constable, and to his 16-year-old daughter, Constance, Mr. Kent ordered to go fetch the local priest. Now, Mr. Kent, rather than stay and search for Frances, rode 5 miles to a nearby town of Trowbridge, Wiltshire, to inform the police superintendent, John Foley. Now, during all this commotion, 2 local men nearby, called Nutt and Benger, came to the house to help the search. It was them who noticed a small pool of blood outside the staff privy, which was the outside toilet in the gardens of the house. The men walked in, and one of the men reached down into the privy and pulled out a large bloody bundle. It was unfortunately Frances, wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket from his cot. The murder was bloody and incredibly brutal, and I don't believe the details of which are pertinent to the story. All there is to know is that a murder weapon had been used in a cruel and vile way, but it was not present at the location of the body. The little boy's body was brought back into the house, and a doctor was called. The doctor estimated that Frances was killed at around 3 a.m, and by 10 a.m, the entire building, residence, and all of their clothing was under inspection. Despite this intense search, nothing was found. Yet Elizabeth Gow, the nursemaid, was arrested, for she was the last person to have seen Frances. However, later she was freed, as no evidence was brought against her, and even Mrs. Kent, the mother, did not believe that she could be the murderer. When the police came stuck, a national outcry grew over the case, and the famous detective Jack Witcher of London Scotland Yard was sent to solve the case on July the 14th. Now, Witcher listened to all these details and quickly deduced that the open window in the downstairs drawing room was a red herring, and he had his suspicions immediately. Witcher's suspicions immediately fell on 16-year-old Constance Kent, the youngest girl from Mr. Kent's first marriage. Now, whilst you may think already there were a lot of children in this household, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Mr. Kent had more children than those in the house. Constance was the 5th daughter and the 9th child with his first wife, Mary Ann. Yes, in total, Mr. Kent had had 13 children, with the 14th on the way. Now, rumour had it that his first wife had become incredibly mentally unwell after bearing so many children, 4 of whom died in infancy. Because her mother was so ill, Constance and her younger brother William were raised by a woman, 24-year-old Mary Pratt. Now, there were rumours that Mary Pratt and Mr. Kent were having an affair during his wife's illness, and 15 months after she died, Mary Pratt and Mr. Kent got married. Yes, the Mary that raised Constance as a nanny became her new stepmother and the mother of Frances. Now, it was quite well known that Constance was not a happy child. Just 3 years prior, at the age of 13, she ran away from home with her brother William, who was then 11 years old. Constance cut off all her hair and changed herself into boys' clothing and headed towards Bristol with the intention of boarding a ship, but the pair were found 9 miles away from home and swiftly returned. What also drew his attention to her was that her nightgown from the night of Frances's murder was missing. Mr. Kent was the one that told him this, for apparently his laundress told Mr. Kent that the nightgown wasn't the present. And finally, the privy. When Constance ran away 3 years ago, she stuffed the bits of her chopped off hair and her old clothes into the exact same spot as Frances's body. And on the 20th of July, with that circumstantial evidence, Constance was arrested. But Witcher still needed more proof and a motive. You see, it was all very confusing. Both the nursemaid and her school friends reported never having heard Constance say a bad word against her half-brother. There was no animosity, and as time went by, Witcher failed to find any motive or evidence for the murder. As such, Constance was released from custody, and Witcher's failure to solve the case left him with a bruised reputation that took a long time to recover from. But little did he know that the crucial evidence he was looking for would be found. Magistrate Thomas Bush Saunders was from nearby Bradford-upon-Avon, and he managed to find out that police had found her nightdress. It was hidden at Road Hill House, the very day after the murder. It was dirty, with some blood on it, but the superintendent dismissed it as just merely menstrual blood, and that the nightgown was hidden in shame. And so that was that. No one was arrested. Constance finished finishing school, and then was sent off to a convent in France. She returned to England to live in Brighton's St Mary's House for Religious Ladies. And then, in 1865, aged 21, Constance confessed. She walked into London's Bow Street Magistrates' Court and handed over a letter which read, quote, "I, Constance Emily Kent, alone and unaided on the night of the 29th of June, 1860, murdered at Road Hill House, Wiltshire, one Francis Saville Kent. Before the deed, none knew of my intention, nor after of my guilt. No one assisted me in the crime, nor in my evasion of discovery." Constance was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death by hanging, only to be reprieved by Queen Victoria herself. Instead, she went on to serve 20 years in prison before being released in July 1885 at age 41. In early 1886, she emigrated to Australia under a new identity, and she died aged 100 in 1944. Now, not everyone believed Constance was the true murderer, including Charles Dickens. After all, where was the motive? Why would she have animosity towards Francis out of all the 3 children that her father's second wife had? The most popular theory amongst him and others was that Mr. Kent was the murderer. You see, people believed that he was repeating history, sleeping with the young nursemaid whilst his pregnant wife was asleep, and in a rage or fear of being caught by a stirring baby, slaughtered him. Now that seems like quite an extreme response, but Mr. Kent was also the only one who insisted that someone from outside the household killed Francis, because he wasn't a popular man in the village and believed someone was out to get revenge on him, and Francis was evidently his favourite child. But it looked rather suspicious after all. I mean, he was the only one who chose to ride away quite a distance during the search party for his son, rather than stay and help. And him fleeing the scene provided the perfect opportunity to dispose of any incriminating evidence, including the murder weapon, which was never found. But you're probably thinking, well, Constance, William and the groundsman were also sent off the property that morning, but there's the rub. They were sent off the property that morning by orders of Mr. Kent. There was no insinuation that they left the property of their own free will to dispose of evidence. Now, for the journalists, nursemaid Emily Gow was still the main suspect. If she was having an affair with Mr. Kent, the young, talkative Francis may have been a witness to what was going on, and it made sense. I mean, how on earth could someone sleep through a child's abduction? A later theory would be presented that it was actually William, Constance's younger brother of the first marriage, who was either an accomplice or the guilty party, and it was his sister who took the fall for him. All we know is there was no doubt that Francis was Mr. Kent's favourite child, so the motive was less likely to be animosity towards the boy himself and more of a punishment of Mr. Kent. But whether that was for his favouritism or a personal vendetta, we'll never know. 3 years after her confession, Wilkie Collins's Moonstone was published in 1868. Detective Witcher of the story went on to inspire characters such as Inspector Bucket from Charles Dickens's Bleak House and Colin Dexter's Inspector Morse. It was probably this case and others where the active participation of the public in a tentatively solved case, which spanned years, displayed to publishers and writers the public's appetite for participating in amateur detective work, and undoubtedly spurred the inspiration for more detective writing, which has become a staple genre in literature, particularly British literature. I hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing and sending in your suggestions for videos down below. I have a Google form where you can send in your requests for things you want me to explore. This was just a random thought process that I went down, wondering when the oldest crime or detective novel ever happened. Thank you, as always, to my Patreons for making today's video possible, and to my librarians on Patreon. We have Eric Taylor, Cody Martin, Yvonne and Yvonne, Jenny Edivane, Marina, Psycho Teddy, Fritz Anderson, Wee Lauren, Nicholas Reed and Andrea Bazil. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.